Some of the best moments from the Prisoner of Azkaban book never made it on screen, simply because the movie had to cut things down to make everything fit within a reasonable amount of time. Specifically, this means that Harry's time in school is extremely brief, and we miss out on classes, characters, and key moments which build out the story as a whole. So that's why today I'm gonna unpack everything that happened from the time Harry had his first Defense Against the Dark Arts class with Lupin to when Sirius Black snuck into the castle and attacked the Fat Lady. This set of scenes only takes a few minutes in the movie, which means that they had to cut down these 2 chapters and take out a bunch of fun and interesting details, all of which I'm gonna reveal to you today. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 35 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. This is the show where each week I take the Harry Potter movies and compare them to the books to find all the differences along the way. Before we jump into the scene recap and analysis, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened in these scenes in the movie so that they're fresh on our mind for the analysis. Picking up with where we last left off, we see the Great Hall as students are studying inside, and the camera pans to our main trio. While it does, we overhear Draco talking to Pansy Parkinson and the other Slytherins about his arm, and Ron remarks that he's laying it on thick. Harry says that at least Hagrid didn't get fired, but Hermione seems to think that they haven't heard the end of this, as Draco's dad is furious. Before they can discuss this topic any further, however, Seamus runs in and shouts that he's been spotted, meaning Sirius Black, and he lays out the Daily Prophet, which shows a picture of Black on the front. And with that, the movie cuts to a later time as Harry and his classmates are in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom with Lupin. We then watch as Professor Lupin has Neville come forward and take the first stab at their practical lesson for the day, which is about Boggarts. The Boggart comes out of the wardrobe in the form of Snape, and Neville uses the spell they learned to make it wear his grandmother's clothes, causing the whole class to burst out in laughter. One by one, the other students give it a try, with Ron's turning into a spider and Parvati Patil's turning into a snake. Eventually, Harry is up next, and the Boggart turns into a Dementor. But right as it does, Lupin jumps in front of Harry and the Dementor transforms into a full moon. Lupin then casts a spell and the Boggart turns into a balloon and flies back inside the wardrobe. And with that, he ends the class. We then cut to another day as the students are outside about to head to Hogsmeade, and Harry doesn't get his permission slip signed by McGonagall, and therefore he can't go. Now that he's alone in the castle, as his classmates are gone for the day, we see Harry talking with Lupin, and they discuss the previous class and why Lupin jumped in front of Harry. They also talk about Harry's parents, as Lupin reveals that he knew both of them, and then the movie cuts to a later time once again, as the Gryffindor students attempt to get inside of their common room. The Fat Lady is gone from her portrait, which has been slashed to pieces, and after Dumbledore arrives and locates her, we find out that the crime was committed by none other than Sirius Black. And that is where scenes end for this week. Now let's dive into the first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up for characters, we're missing quite a few. Or rather, some of them we might briefly see, but in the book they actually have speaking parts or larger roles. These characters are Lavender Brown, Snape, Oliver Wood and the rest of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, Colin Creevey, and Peeves. That's right, our beloved Peeves is back. And not only is he back, but he'll show up twice in this week's episode. Next, for timeline, there really isn't much to discuss, except the usual issue of the passage of time not being conveyed properly. In the book, this section takes place from Harry's first Defense Against the Dark Arts class, which would have been their first or second week in school, all the way to Halloween, which is when Sirius Black attacked the Fat Lady. So in total, it's about 6 to 8 weeks. In the movie though, we just cut from scene to scene without any reference for the passage of time. Finally, before getting to the plot changes, we have location. This week, we have 3 locations which were changed and 3 that were removed. As for the removed ones, that is obviously Gryffindor Tower, which is pretty much in every chapter of the book, and then the Herbology and Transfiguration classrooms. But regarding the changed locations, first up is the Potions classroom. Technically, this is where their very first scene should have happened, the one where they're in the Great Hall and Draco is talking about his arm. Second, Lupin and Harry's conversation actually happens in Lupin's office, and there's a crucial plot change regarding that conversation as well, so stick around for that. And lastly, they don't have the Defense Against the Dark Arts class in the actual classroom, but rather they have it in the staff room. And I think that wraps up the location changes. Now, before I dive into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that I can't go line by line comparing word changes because that would take forever. Instead, I highly recommend you check out the audiobooks on Audible if you're interested in reliving the Wizarding world for yourself firsthand. You can claim your free trial of Audible using my link in the description, which gets you one free audiobook of your choice and supports the channel at the same time. Now, with that being said, let's get into the plot changes. For our first change, we really need to look at what's happening in this first scene, because almost every word spoken is purposeful in recreating a moment in the book which was removed, and that would be their potions class. You see, this moment in the Great Hall never happens in the book, but I can see what they were trying to do, because Draco's lines, the trio's response, and then Seamus bringing in the Daily Prophet can all be directly traced back to this omitted class. The start of the chapter in the book tells us how they were about halfway through double potions with the Slytherins when Draco strolled into class with his arm bandaged up. We read that Pansy Parkinson asked Draco how he's feeling and if his arm hurts, and he told her yes, but Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle. Then, because his arm was quote-unquote hurt, Draco told Professor Snape that he would need help with his potion ingredients, and Snape assigned Ron and Harry to the task. At first, Ron chopped up Draco's roots in a rough manner, so Snape made Ron give his own roots to Draco instead. Then Harry was forced to skin Draco's shrivel fig. It is all super embarrassing for the boys, and they are very angry with Draco as they know he is just faking it. On top of this, Draco antagonizes them about Hagrid and mentions that his father is furious and submitted complaints to the school governors and the Ministry of Magic. Obviously, you can see here the similarity between the lines we get from our trio in the movie version and this potions class in the book. Something that isn't in the movie version, though, is Neville's potion. We read about how his potion turned orange, which it wasn't supposed to, and Snape got on his case about it, and told him that at the end of the class, they would test his potion on Trevor, Neville's toad. Neville then freaked out and asked Hermione for help, and at the end of the class, his potion worked. But Snape deducted points from him for getting help from Hermione. And this moment of Snape bullying Neville is actually what instigates Neville's fear of him, which plays into Lupin's class, but we'll get there in a bit. Lastly, with this potions class, we have Seamus informing Harry about Sirius Black being sighted, which kind of is a separate change as well, as in the book, we just learn that Sirius was spotted not too far from here, but in the movie, they actually name a location, Dufftown. Also, Seamus is pretty quiet about it in the book, as he just shares it with Harry and Ron, whereas the movie has him running and shouting to the whole school about it in the Great Hall. After Seamus shares this information with Harry, Draco, who is nearby and heard Seamus, tells Harry that if it were him, he would go searching for Black. Draco continues on and keeps insinuating that he knows something about Black that Harry doesn't. Obviously, Draco is referring to the fact that Sirius Black is the reason Harry's parents got killed, but Harry won't learn about that story until later on. This vague teasing from Draco gets on Harry's nerves, but Ron tells him that Draco probably just wants him to do something stupid and get in trouble, so they move on. Our next change comes immediately after their potions class as the trio is walking out, upset at the fact that Snape deducted points from Neville for him properly making the potion, even though he did get Hermione's help. But that's not the key detail of this moment. The crucial thing we miss is that in the book, this is the first time Hermione messes up with her time turner. We have already had a couple moments in the movie of her randomly appearing, but in the book, this is the first time we read that Ron looked back at her and she was gone. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been walking up some steps, and when Hermione disappeared, Harry and Ron were at the top of the stairs. Then, after a moment of looking through the crowd of students, they saw Hermione at the bottom of the steps, panting and running up to them. Harry also notes that it looked like she was tucking something down the front of her shirt when she came towards them. And this is another small change which I'll probably continue to mention in multiple episodes, and that is that I think it's ridiculous that the movie just has Hermione wearing the time turner in the open. I know a lot of people probably wouldn't know what it is, but still, book Hermione at least tries to hide it, whereas movie Hermione wears it as if she's showing off a diamond necklace. That's just a small thing, but it bugs me every time I see these scenes. But now we finally can move on and address their defense against the dark arts class. The first change we have here is actually that they don't have the class in the classroom itself. Like I mentioned in the location changes, they go to a boggart that is in a wardrobe in the teacher's lounge. So we read that as the students sat in the class, Lupin walked in and informed them that they would be having a practical lesson today, so they could leave their books behind and follow him to the teacher's lounge with their wands. And this brings us to the next change, which is the omission of Peeves. Man, I missed Peeves. But here he is back again, and Lupin does something quite impressive here because of him. As they walked through the halls, they eventually came upon the poltergeist wreaking havoc as he usually did, and when Peeves saw Lupin, he made fun of him. He started calling him Loony Lupin, and the students were surprised, as typically Peeves didn't pick on teachers. But as we know, Peeves was around Lupin when he was a kid at school, so they're probably on more of a friendly basis. Or at least Peeves thinks so. Anyway, Lupin then reprimanded Peeves for shoving gum in the keyhole of the door next to him, and Peeves just continued to taunt him. So Lupin told the students to pay attention as this is a very useful spell, and he said wadiwasi, which caused the gum to shoot out of the keyhole and up Peeves' nose, making him sputter and choke and fly away. And all the Gryffindors were majorly impressed by this act, because usually Peeves is impossible to harm. Next, a small change I want to note is that technically the Gryffindors had defense against the dark arts alone, so Draco and his goons wouldn't have been in this class like the movie shows. But moving on from that, we now come to the Boggart itself, and all the changes revolving around this class. For some context, the students arrived in the staff room and found Snape there sitting in a chair, but he got up and on his way out, he insulted Neville, telling Lupin to beware as Neville wreaks havoc wherever he goes. This caused Neville to be extremely embarrassed, and probably added onto his fear of Snape. But as you know, he got payback pretty quick for this, as Snape is going to have some embarrassment thrown his way despite him not even being present. Which brings us to our next change, and that is that in the book, Lupin teaches the class what to do, and using Neville as the test has Neville go through the steps out loud. Neville describes his grandmother's clothes, and Lupin explains that once Neville does the spell, Snape should be wearing his grandma's clothes. I get that in the movie they wanted this to be more fun and a surprise, but in the book it isn't a secret, and everything is said out loud. Next, every student faces the Boggart, not just a couple. Maybe they cycled through everyone but just didn't show it in the movie, but it does seem like it goes Neville, Ron, Parvati, and then Harry. But in the book, we learn about Seamus going and the Boggart turning into a banshee, and then for the next student it turned into a rattlesnake, and then it was a bloody eyeball, and then a severed hand, and so on and so forth. Until finally Ron went and he did his spider thing, and then after that Lupin stepped in front of Harry, who was behind Ron. Which brings on a series of small changes. First, in the movie, the Boggart turns into a Dementor, but in the book, the Boggart doesn't even have a chance to face Harry at all. Second, Lupin's Boggart turns into a glowing white ball hovering in the air, which the students are unable to identify as the moon. However, in the movie, it is very clearly a full moon. And third, after Lupin faces the Boggart, he has Neville come back up, and Neville does his Snape one again, and the final laughter from the students causes the Boggart to explode. That's right, they didn't just put it back inside the wardrobe, they killed it. However, the explosion wasn't gruesome or anything like that, it was more of a pop and then the Boggart disappeared. Then Lupin ended the class, giving 5 points to each person who faced the Boggart, and 10 to Neville since he faced it twice. He also gave 5 points to Hermione and Harry each, who both didn't get a chance to face the creature, but they got points because they each answered a question at the beginning of class. And that wraps up that chapter, but not our changes for this week, because we still need to address the Hogsmeade trip and then Sirius Black's attack on the Fat Lady. So moving into the next chapter, which is titled Flight of the Fat Lady, we come to our next change, which is the fact that the start of this chapter contains some details which the movie chose to omit. These details help convey the passage of time in the book, as Harry fills the reader in on how classes were going and various other things. We learn that Defense Against the Dark Arts had quickly become every student's favorite class, that potions had gotten much worse for the Gryffindors after the whole Snape-Boggart fiasco, because Snape was embarrassed by it. And we learn that every time Harry was in divination with Professor Trelawney, she would tear up when she looked at him. We also read that Care of Magical Creatures was everyone's least favorite class, since after Draco got hurt, Hagrid had toned down his teaching. A lot. So much so that all they did every week was feed flobberworms, which were pretty much giant slugs that did nothing, and had to be hand-fed lettuce. It was gross and boring, and Hagrid was always sad because he couldn't do what he wanted to do with the trial looming overhead. The next thing from this chapter which the movie removed is Quidditch, and this will be a common theme for the rest of the Harry Potter series. There isn't much to discuss, but we do learn that in October, Quidditch season had started and the Gryffindor team began to practice. Oliver Wood gave them their normal pep talk, and their first game was scheduled to be against Slytherin, so Oliver had them practicing moves to specifically counter that team. That is important later on because, as you know in the movie, they don't actually play Slytherin, they play Hufflepuff, and this throws a massive wrench in Wood's plan, but we'll cover that in a future episode. Anyway, this segues into the next omission, because after their practice one day, Harry came into the common room to see the students gathered around a notice that had been posted, which informed them of the first Hogsmeade trip. This trip was scheduled for October 31st. In the movie, we don't get this as it immediately cuts to the Hogsmeade trip after their first Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Plus, in the book, as the trio talked about the trip, with Ron telling Harry that he should still go even though he's not supposed to leave the castle, we get yet another Crookshanks attack as the cat pounced on Ron's bag and began yanking it around. Of course, as you might have guessed, Scabbers the rat was inside the bag, and eventually he got flung out and ran off with Crookshanks chasing after him. Ron eventually found his rat and was very upset at Hermione about this, and Hermione felt bad but was also defensive of her cat. The book then moves on to the next day, which contains our next omitted moment. Ron was still upset at Hermione because of Crookshank's attack the night before, but during herbology class, Hermione asked how Scabbers was, and Ron replied that he's still shaking under Ron's bed and won't come out. Then they went to Transfiguration class next, and while waiting outside the classroom, they noticed a disturbance at the front of the line. Lavender Brown was crying and Parvati Patel was comforting her. Hermione asked her what was wrong, and Parvati explained that Lavender just got a letter saying her bunny had died. Then Lavender said that she should have known. After all, it's the 16th of October, which was the exact day that Professor Trelawney had predicted something dreadful would happen to her. Hermione tried to reason with her, saying that Binky, the bunny, would have died days ago if she just now got the letter, so technically it didn't happen on the 16th. But this just angered Parvati, and Ron loudly told Lavender to ignore Hermione, because Hermione doesn't care about other people's pets. And thankfully, before this could escalate any further, Professor McGonagall opened the door and let the class in. Now we have a change that isn't a straight-up omitted moment, but an actual change regarding what happens in the film. And it's that Harry actually asks McGonagall for her signature after Transfiguration class, not while they're exiting the castle to go to Hogsmeade. The dialogue itself, however, is pretty similar, with Harry noticing that McGonagall had some sympathy for him in this, but for some unspoken reason wouldn't let him go. And now we're heading into the home stretch as we have a handful of changes left for this week. The first of which being the removal of Harry's time at the castle by himself before he met up with Lupin. First, he ran into Colin Creevey, since only the third years and up could go to Hogsmeade, and of course Harry turned right back around and headed out of the common room to avoid hanging out with Colin. Then he ran into Filch, who started barking at him to go back to his common room, because as always, Filch assumes the worst of every student. But eventually, after these two unpleasant encounters, Harry found himself running into Lupin, who asked him what he was doing alone. Harry explained that Hermione and Ron were at Hogsmeade, and Lupin seemed to understand, and then invited Harry into his office to show him the Grindylow he had just gotten delivered for their next class. The two of them ended up sitting down and talking for quite a while, which is similar to what we see in the movie, except for a couple key differences. First, as I mentioned in the location changes, they talk in Lupin's office, not on the bridge outside of the castle. And second, and maybe most importantly, the movie removed Snape's delivery of Lupin's potion, which is called Wolfsbane Potion. Of course, during this instance, the potion isn't named, and Harry doesn't know what it is. He simply sees Snape, his least favorite teacher, bringing Lupin a steaming cup of a potion, and Lupin drinking it despite Harry's warning that Snape would do anything to get the job of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. We read that Harry seriously thinks Snape might try to poison Lupin for the position, as he could tell that Snape wasn't fond of the new teacher, and obviously Harry is biased against Snape to begin with. But anyway, after their talk and Snape bringing Lupin his potion, Harry headed back to the common room and met up with Ron and Hermione, who brought him loads of candy from Hogsmeade, which is our next change. You see, in the movie, Harry, Ron, and Hermione are walking back to the common room talking about the Hogsmeade trip, and then they see the fat lady's portrait slashed. But in the book, the trio meet back up in the common room before the Halloween feast and talk about the trip. Plus, Harry tells them about Snape bringing Lupin a potion. It's then after the feast that they come back to the common room to find the portrait has been attacked. And that takes us into the final change for this week, which is that the fat lady doesn't tell them who attacked her. Peeves does. Peeves was at the portrait and was being an annoyance as usual, but when Dumbledore approached and questioned him, he got serious and told Dumbledore exactly what happened. Obviously, he still relished the moment, and he ended the explanation by stating it was Sirius Black who committed the crime. And on that note, the chapter ends. And so do our changes for this week. So now that you've heard all of these details, changes, and omitted moments, what do you think? Which of these parts of the book would you have liked to see most in the film? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.